Hello everyone. So in this session we are going to discuss on business writing and the basic guidelines for it. Now the first thing to understand is that business writing is something that can make or break your business. Think about this. 5 common mistakes that are sabotaging your sales. And now compare this particular tagline to something like, today I am going to discuss the common mistakes that you do in business writing. Which of these do you find interesting? The first one, right? Why? Because it has a certain hook to it. And this is one of the many differences between a good business writing piece versus a great business writing content piece. So today we are going to discuss a few key features or a few key things to consider so that you become a better business writer. So the first thing is the choice of words. So typically, it's almost like a curse of knowledge that you feel very comfortable in using jargons or acronyms that are very relatable to you. But it is very important to understand that these jargons and acronyms might not be as familiar to the audience that you're targeting. So as a rule of thumb, make sure that the first time that you're using any acronym or any abbreviation, you expand it, and further down in the content piece you can keep the abbreviation. For example, if I'm writing an article on AR, the first time I mention AR, I should probably have accounts receivable written in the bracket, and further on in the content I can choose to write AR as an abbreviation for that. Another thing that we typically do is a mistake in the choice of words, and these words are typically those which sound very similar. For example, how do you use among and between? Ideally, among is used when you have three or more entities, while between should only be used when you have two entities, right? For example, the prize was divided amongst several contestants, versus you say you have a choice between carrots and beans, right? So among is used between three or more entities, while between is used between two. And this is just one example, but you'll find many more such examples where you confuse between words that's, it seems like they're almost same to use, but they're very, very different. The next thing that you would probably want to focus on is the flow or the logic to your content piece. The primary thing to think about here is about knowing your audience. So whenever you're working on any content, the first thing that you should probably do is do your homework in terms of what are the audience's interests, what are their biases, what are things that are most crucial to them, what are their pain points, what are the things that they would benefit from, right? And you should form your entire content and communication strategy based on their biases and their interests. The second important thing is build a logical and a good argument. It's not important to write really flowery language and put the things that look really good together without a logic to the entire piece, right? The third thing and the most important thing is that people are not free to sit down and just read your article. It is very important to keep your message as short as possible, because understand that long documents tend to be intimidating to the listeners, and they seem to tune out because the entire thing seems just like rambling versus an interaction or an engagement. Another thing to keep in mind probably is your audience's bias. For example, maybe the content piece that you're positioning is based on a controversy. So your entire tone should be in a manner that speaks to that controversy, right? You should understand that whether the audience would be in favor of what you're writing or against it. And if you're against it, how do you convince the audience to, go with the thought of your that is there in your mind. The next thing to consider is spellings. One thumb rule again, always use a spell check. You can never be sure of what you've written, but also realize that spell check is also not foolproof. So irrespective of whether this is your third draft or second draft or the final or the 10th draft, you should always make sure that you do a spell check And after doing a spell check, you also do a proofread, because like I said, spell checks are also not foolproof. Once you do that proofreading, you can also choose to get your entire document or content piece be proofread by another person, because a different eye might be able to notice some mistakes that you were not able to notice the first time you did the proofreading, right? Another thing here is that avoid common mistakes, and when I say avoid common mistakes, I'm more referring more in terms of the spelling mistakes that you do, because sometimes these mistakes can change the entire meaning of the sentence that you're trying to say or the word that you're using. A common example could be YOU apostrophe R E and YOUR, your and you are, right? It's a very common mistake, but it often changes the entire meaning of the sentence. The next thing that we can talk about is style tips. So understand that, when you present a very complex piece of infographic or content in front of an audience, they'll probably be intimidated or feel that it's too difficult to understand, so let me just skip it. So you always want to go for a simple layout versus a more complex layout for any content piece or your document, right? Another thing that is pretty important is good looks, right? That is, good looks are things to behold, and any document that looks better sells better. But you also want to make sure that your good looking document is also professional, because you're not doing an art show, right? You're not presenting your document in an art gallery. You would want to look at more professional so that it can be presented to corporate heads, CFOs, and directors. So you always need to keep your audience in mind whenever you're designing your content piece. And how do you design your content piece right? You think about the typefaces that you're using. You think about the spacing. If you're uh, making a content for Halloween, you'll probably use a font that is very different from a font that you would use for your resume. So you should always think about the right typeface for the right audience. Other things to keep in mind are probably spacings and margins, right? You do not want to be inconsistent in how you put margins across different pieces of your content. And similarly, for spacing, you do not want to be inconsistent with the spacing. For instance, spacing between comma, the word before the comma, and the word after the comma. So you can choose to have a word, comma, have a space, and then have the other word. Or you could have the word, space, comma, and then the other word. But either ways, whatever rule that you're following, it has to be consistent across the entire document. Understand that all of these small choices that you're making is almost like a professional image that you're presenting. It's almost like a display picture or a profile picture of your company that you're presenting through your content, and these tiny mistakes can go a long way in terms of making a bad reputation of your company in the world. Another important thing is introduction, right? So when I started with this session, I introduced that this is something that we are going to talk about. But I also try to start with a comparison between an interesting business writing quotation and a not so interesting business writing quotation. So it is very important to have an effective introduction to any content piece. And the three things that you should be aiming for is one, build the writer's interest or build the reader's interest in reading the rest of your document. If the person is bored in the first paragraph itself, they'll probably not read through the rest of the article. The second thing is you should be able to explain the purpose for your article or the purpose for your writing. The third thing is it should provide a preview to the rest of the document. So I understand that the second and third points here might seem similar, but the objective of the second point here, explaining your purpose of writing, is that it should be really crisp. The first sentence piques your interest, second sentence tells you about what the content is about. And from third, you can give a preview of the document. But understand that the reader will probably spend 10 seconds to go through the first and second line, and that will decide that whether the reader wants to go to through the rest of your document. The next thing is conclusion, right? The end of your document is another very powerful area. It determines whether the reader is left with actually clicking on your call to action, or does that reader just want to go back and press the back button there. Three things that you should definitely avoid here is one, introducing a new topic. So while you're at the end of your entire document, you do not want to start another idea or another new topic, because what this will do is divert your reader's attention from your communication objective. Now, an interesting point here is a food for thought. So, it's pretty common for really good speakers and writers to end their business communication with a food for thought. But understand that this food for thought should also be related to your primary objective for the writing piece, right? Your primary topic. It should still be related to that. It could be something with a different angle to it. It could be something really game changing, but still it has to be related to the core topic you're talking about. The second thing is that you should avoid reinstating your main idea in pompous words. Guys, understand this will just piss the reader off, right? You're trying to say the same thing, but you're taking up time with pompous words and something that the reader would probably not like. The third thing is that you should not undercut your argument towards the end. You should not say something contradictory or something that is not really going with the rest of your topic or the rest of the flow of your topic towards the end. You might want to say something like, hey, this is my opinion, but you can feel free to differ because of this. Talking till the point where you say you might want to differ is fine, but when you try to justify why someone might have a different opinion, it almost seems like you're undercutting your own points that you've mentioned before. So you should always avoid doing that. The next thing that we'll probably go about is paragraphs and sentences and some of the best practices that you could follow. The first thing is obviously breaking down your topic. So think about it. Even with your one article that is probably 1,000 words, you're trying to explain a story or you're trying to tell a story. So it's always good to have that story broken down to different plots and different characters, and it just helps the reader to understand where is the flow going. And it also helps that sometimes the reader might not want to read through the whole of your article. They might just want to focus on one particular section. And if you break down the entire content piece into different topics and subtopics, it'll be easier for the reader to navigate to that particular topic or subtopic. Second thing to keep in mind is that you need to ensure that there's a smooth flow between one idea to another. So this is something that we call transition, right? So you could say, so for example, if I am trying to talk about three things why you should read this, you should read a particular article. I could say firstly, and explain the reason. Secondly, and explain the reason. And thirdly, or lastly, and explain the reason. So all of these words that I'm using, firstly, secondly, and lastly, they're almost they're almost like a transition words that are adding the flow or improving the flow of the entire content piece. The third thing to understand is to understand the difference between transition and addition, right? When you say transition, you basically transitioning from one thought or one idea or one subtopic to another, right? The first subtopic could probably be about the pain points that a customer is facing. The second subtopic could be about the solution that you are providing. The third subtopic could be about the benefits. So all of those three things are, you're basically transitioning between pain points to solution to the benefits. But when you say about addition, it's almost like you're trying to add special feature section within the solution part. So it's almost like an additional piece that you're adding. It's not really a subtopic or a subsection, it's just an additional piece. So it's very important that when you're writing that article, a reader is able to differentiate between the different topics and the additional items that you're adding. So how an easy way to add these additional items is to use words like further on, moreover, adding to that. Things like this will make the reader understand that this is just something that you're adding over the subtopic that you already have. The next and very important thing in today's first world is using complete sentences. Now that we're all used to using that same WhatsApp or SMS language everywhere, it is very important that you do not do the same in business writing. For example, there's an example here on your screen. I met them in Chicago on their way home from a European vacation. Now, this is a complete sentence versus I met them in Chicago coming home from a vacation in Europe. So, what the person is practically has essentially done in the second sentence is breaking the same sentence with a full stop, while all they had to do was probably use a comma here. So, do not break your sentences unnecessarily just for the sake of doing it. The third thing, and a very important thing again, is wordiness. So, a lot of us think that if we use really complex words or if we use really pompous and grand scheme of things kind of words, it'll be more, it will be more appreciated by the readers. But then think about the same, right? If you are presented with a really complex word and the logic is pretty simple, the content is about something that is very easy to understand, but the words that you've used in are complicating things for the user, you'll probably not like that, right? So you should avoid using that extra or flowery words because they are typically very irrational and uneconomical in business writing. Why do I say uneconomical? Because a lot of times for these business writings, for example ads, you basically pay someone to have your ad posted at some place. So when that happens, the every space that you're utilizing there is basically charged. So you do not want to add unnecessarily words there which basically take up your space and by extension your money without adding any real value.